Hi, I'm Maggie Craig and this is my new non-fiction book, 1 Week in April, The Scottish Radical Rising of 1820. 200 years ago, in one intense week at the beginning of April 1820, political protest erupted across central Scotland and Ayrshire. It was part of growing unrest throughout Britain in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, made worse when tens of thousands of demobbed soldiers came home and looked for work, swamping the labour market. The demand was for reform of the corrupt and very undemocratic Westminster Parliament, universal suffrage and the repeal of the hated Corn Laws. These kept the price of a loaf of bread artificially high, protecting the interests of landowners, farmers and grain merchants at the expense of the poor. Those who wanted this radical reform hoped an improvement in often brutal living and working conditions would follow. In October 1816, at a mass meeting advocating reform, 40,000 people gathered in green fields north of Glasgow Cathedral at what was then the Thrushgrove estate of James Turner, who was a Glasgow businessman and reformer. Thrushgrove subsequently disappeared under industrial and development and housing, but you can still see the lie of the land today in the district of Royston, known to older residents as the Garn Gad. One of the speakers at the Thrushgrove meeting spoke of how the poor were struggling to feed and clothe their children and keep a roof over their families' heads. And I'll just read you a wee bit of what was said on that day at Thrushgrove. Benjamin Gray, who was a shoemaker in Nelson Street in Glasgow, gave the first speech. He painted a grim picture of life in the post-war slump. It is now universally admitted that almost all classes in this country are labouring under an overwhelming load of indescribable calamity. Differences of opinion there may be as to the cause, but there can be none as to the existence of the evil. In every corner of this once flourishing country, one hideous picture of misery presents itself. Commerce and manufactures and agriculture all groan beneath impending ruin. Bankruptcy crowds upon bankruptcy. Gray went on to lament the number of shops which had closed and the many other businesses where employers had reluctantly had to tell their workers they could no longer afford to keep them on. This was a calamity for what he called the industrious working poor, many of whom were going hungry. Some had been forced to sell what few treasures they owned, what he called their keepsakes. Homeless and heartbroken, some had gone on the tramp to beg for their bread because they couldn't find work. It was a cold day at Thrushgrove and the speeches were long, yet people stood and waited patiently, cheering what was being said. One roar of approval was heard from a mile away. This being Glasgow, there was humour and a few wisecracks. Another speaker, John Russell, made one in a tirade against all the taxes being imposed to help pay for the recent war. We are grievously harassed and borne down with the salt tax and the leather tax, the soap tax and the candle tax, the manservant tax, the cart tax, the horse tax and the dog tax, and with such a tremendous list of other taxes that the very name of them is like to break our hearts and frighten us to death. It was that mention of the dog tax which got him a laugh. Dog licences had first been introduced in the late 1790s. Lists of some of those who stumped up for one can be found online at the Scotland's Places website. Fast forward to August 1819 in Manchester, where the growing unrest throughout the country led to the Peterloo massacre, when a huge but peaceful crowd of people calling for radical political reform was charged by the local yeomanry. At least 15 people were killed and over 600 wounded. In Scotland and elsewhere, impassioned demonstrations were held to protest against lethal military force being used against unarmed civilians. The following year in Scotland, overnight between 1st and 2nd of April 1820, thousands of copies of a poster were put up in public places. This was the address to the inhabitants of Great Britain and Ireland, and it called for a general strike. The call was answered. Both sides agreed that 60,000 people, weavers, spinners, colliers and other workers, down tools. The address stated that it had been issued by order of the Committee of Organisation for forming a provisional government. As well as the general strike, it also asked people to be ready to fight for their rights. Liberty or death is our motto, and we have sworn to return in triumph or return home no more. Some were prepared to take up arms. They had some guns, but the weapon of choice was the pike. These ancient but potentially vicious weapons were the easiest and cheapest for working men to make. Under the command of weavers Andrew Hardy and John Baird, a small army marched out of Glasgow and Condorit at Cumbernauld, heading for the Carron Ironworks near Falkirk with the aim of seizing cannons. They were intercepted by a party of dragoons from the regular army and the local Stirlingshire militia. In a short, intense skirmish, the little radical army fought bravely but was overpowered, most of them captured and taken to imprisonment in Stirling Castle. Another group of weavers marched out of their hometown of Straven in Lanarkshire, carrying a flag on which were the words "Scotland Free" or "Scotland a Desert." I'm sitting here in front of a replica of that flag. If you want to find out what happened to the original one, you'll have to read my book. One resident of Straven described them as going out to fight for the rights of old Scotland. The Straven pioneers, as they dubbed themselves, thought they were going to rendezvous with a French army encamped on the Cathkin Braes south of Glasgow, ready to mount attack on the city, but they had been duped. This was a false report put out by government agents and agents provocateurs, designed to flush out the radicals so they could then be identified and dealt a series of hammer blows. On the Saturday of the first week of April 1820, 5 radical prisoners, the crackdown had started early, were being transferred from the overcrowded jail, or Bridewell as it was then called, in Paisley, to Greenock, further down the Clyde. They were escorted by the government Port Glasgow militia. The militia found a hostile crowd waiting for them at Greenock. Tempers flared and stones were thrown. The militia retaliated by opening fire on the crowd. 8 people were shot dead, many more injured. Incensed and crying, "Remember Manchester," the crowd stormed the jail and freed the radical prisoners. They made good their escape. Other radicals were not so lucky. Throughout the summer of 1820, trials were held in Stirling, Glasgow, Dumbarton, Paisley and Ayr. 98 men were indicted on charges of high treason, 42 appeared in court, 24 were found guilty, 2 not guilty and the rest acquitted. These were effectively show trials. The radical rising had terrified the authorities and the punishments were harsh and brutal. 3 men were publicly hanged and then beheaded. James Wilson of the Straven Pioneers, a well-respected man of nearly 60, known also by the nickname of Pearly Wilson to do with weaving technique in which he had used the pearl stitch, died in front of a crowd estimated at 20,000 on Glasgow Green, just across the road from Glasgow's High Court. Andrew Hardy and John Baird, who had led the little radical army at the Battle of Bonnymuir, died in Stirling's Broad Street. They were aged 28 and 38 respectively. 19 of the men who had fought with them at Bonnymuir were transported to Australia. Andrew Hardy and John Baird wrote several letters to friends and family. They were smuggled out of Stirling Castle by a woman we know only as Granny Duncan, who earned a few shillings by taking porridge and coffee to the prisoners and their guards. On the night before his execution, Andrew Hardy wrote a letter to his girlfriend Margaret McKee, and again I'll do a short reading from the book here. It is an eloquent letter in which he expresses his love for her. "Could you have thought that I was sufficient to withstand such a shock, which at once burst upon me like an earthquake, and buried all my vain earthly hopes beneath its ruins, and at once left me a poor shipwrecked mariner on this bleak shore, separated from thee, in whom all my hopes were centred. He hoped she would not take it as a dishonour that your unfortunate lover died for his distressed, wronged, suffering and insulting country. No, my dear Margaret, I know you are possessed of nobler ideas than that." She had not always known how strongly he felt about this subject. He told her he needed to lay down his pen, as this will have to go out immediately. Granny Duncan must have been waiting to take the letter, neither she nor Andrew Hardy wanting to arouse suspicion by her lingering too long. Andrew Hardy had asked Granny Duncan to be at the execution, which took place in Broad Street in Stirling on a platform and scaffold which had been erected for that purpose. When he got there, he called out to the crowd, "Granny, are you there?" And she came back and said, "Yes, I'm here, Andrew, my poor young laddie, I'm here." And he said to her, "Bide till the end then," which she did. Shortly before the death sentence was carried out, he made a declaration to the entire crowd: "I die a martyr to the cause of truth and justice." There are memorials to the Scottish radicals of 1820 in various places: Bonnymuir, Stirling, Paisley, Straven and Greenock. They are also remembered in song, most hauntingly in Dark Bonnymuir, beautifully sung today by modern troubadour Alan Dixon. There are also some tangible objects which have survived since 1820, and I'll finish up by reading a few more lines from my book about these. Kept safely away from the light, some relics of the radical rising remain. The pikes carried by the Bonnymuir men, picked up off the field and taken to Stirling Castle, are now in the care of Historic Environment Scotland. They are a tangible and evocative connection to John Baird, Andrew Hardy and the men and boys who marched with them to Bonnymuir. They recall those heady days when men and women called for democracy, social change and fairness. They recall the men who fought and died for the rights of old Scotland and democracy for all. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay well.
As evening dashed on the western ocean, Caledonia stood perched on the waves of the Clyde. Her arms wide extended, she raised with devotion my poor bleeding country, she vehemently cried. Arise up, my country, and hail reformation. Arise and demand now the rights of our nation. Behold, your oppressors shall meet the desolation that marked the brave victims at dark Bonnymuir. On the 5th day of April 1820, the great Baird and Hardy did march from their home to guard their freedom, homes, rights, peace and plenty. But tyranny conquered and gave them a tomb. Like traitors they died on the 8th of September. In the cold, silent grave they were consigned to slumber. But heaven will avenge them, let tyrants remember, and raise up new heroes on dark Bonnymuir. Though freedom has bled on the field sorely wounded, shall liberty perish and die in its bloom? Shall tyranny triumph though freedom has grounded the arms of the heroes that lie ill in the tomb? But freedom shall rise to the greatest perfection, avenging her wrongs with hard words of correction. When on my country with filial affection I sigh for the martyrs of dark Bonnymuir. Long shall tyrants usurp over freedom? How long shall we groan in their vile servile chains? Arise up, my children, and sing them like Sodom. Their sad desolation reigns over the plains. Oh, muse on the day when great Wallace was rearing the broadsword of Scotland, when tyrants were fearing. At the sound of the trumpet, were thousands appearing to die or to conquer on dark bonny Mew. Die or to conquer on dark bonny